everybody, I'm Megan and this is Girl Power History, where we talk about interesting women throughout history. And so let's get into this. The particular woman that we're talking about today she was a prolific writer, a poet who explored themes of death and immortality, and she was also a famous recluse. She never left her house. So this is Emily Dickenson, and let's get into her story. So Emily was born in Amherst, Massachusetts on December 10th, 1830. Now Emily's education as a child was considered ambitiously classical for a Victorian girl, as her father really wanted her and his other children well educated. So Emily, for being a young woman growing up in the mid-1800s, was given a much finer, better education than a lot of other women during her time. She spent a lot of years studying English and classical literature, Latin, botany, geology, history, mental philosophy, and arithmetic. So our girl Emily was rocking it. She was like, I know what's up, I got the smarts, all that good stuff. So here is our girl Emily for today. So the thing about Emily was she was really troubled from a young age about the notions and the idea of death. She had this deepening menace of death, especially the deaths of people that were close to her, like family and friends. And actually, when one of Emily's second cousins, who was also a close friend, Sophia Holland, died from typhus, Emily was actually exceptionally traumatized by the idea of this. She wrote that, "It seemed to me I should die too if I could not be permitted to watch over her or even look at her face." So again, this idea of death was just very troubling. I mean, the idea of death to a lot of people was troubling, but Emily really seemed to harp in on it. She really seemed to get super fixated on the topic of death. As I said, Emily was a very well-known poet, though not during her day. She wasn't a very well-known poet until after she died. But where her love of literature and writing began, it began here. So when she was 18, she was introduced to a man named Benjamin Franklin Newton. Now Newton was the one who introduced, more than likely, Emily to the writings of William Wordsworth, and he also gifted her books from Ralph Waldo Emerson of his collected poems. And Newton really considered Emily to be a very good writer, a very good poet. So they had a lot of influence on each other. When he was actually dying of tuberculosis, he wrote to her saying he would like to live until she achieved the greatness he foresaw in her. A lot of scholars believe that one of Emily's poems she wrote, which goes, "When a little girl, I had a friend who taught me immortality, but venturing too near himself, he never returned." People think that that poem refers to Newton himself. And now she had a lot of different literature influences. A few being Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which for the record, the book is right down here for the record. Jane Eyre being one of my favorite novels. Of course, Shakespeare was also a literature influence on Emily. She referred to Shakespeare's plays as, "Why clasped any hand but this? Why is any other book needed?" Now, let's move into Emily's adulthood and how she sort of got more into writing and how she became this well-known recluse. So, during the 1850s, Emily began a friendship with her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert. This is Susan. Now, Susan was married to Emily's brother, Austin. And just pretend like always that it's a guy, of course. Now, these two women became really, really good friends. Emily actually sent Susan more than 300 letters over the course of their friendship. Now, Susan was really supportive of Emily's writing. She played the role as most beloved friend, influence, muse, and advisor. Now, these two besties were not always known to the public as being best friends. And the reason for this was because Austin, again, remember, was married to Susan. Austin actually had a mistress named Mabel Loomis Todd. Now, Mabel of course, being the mistress to Austin Dickinson, she of course hated his wife, Susan. So of course course these two do not get along. I mean, wife and mistress, I mean, when are they ever gonna get along? So Mabel bashed Susan's name. She diminished the role that Susan played in Emily's life. So Mabel referred to Susan as cruel Susan and all that drama. But Susan and Austen's kids denied that fact and made it clear that Susan and Emily had a very good friendship, and that Mabel was just speaking out of jealousy because she was the mistress and not the wife. Now, an interesting thing is that a lot of scholars refer to Emily and Susan's relationship to be that of a romantic relationship. In the Emily Dickenson journal, Lena Kosky wrote, Dickinson's letters to Gilbert expressed strong homoerotic feelings. In some of Emily's letters to Susan, Emily would write, Susie, will you indeed come home next Saturday and be my own again and kiss me? I hope for you so much and feel so eager for you. Feel that I cannot wait. Feel that now I must have you. That the expectation once more to see your face again makes me feel hot and feverish and my heart beats so fast. My darling, so near I seem to you that I disdain this pen and wait for a warmer language. You know, it'd be one thing if she said, oh, I want to kiss you, which, you know, back in this time, people were much more affectionate about, you know, kissing each other didn't necessarily have to be erotic in nature, but the rest of that letter, you know, speaking about how she was hot and feverish for her, how she was waiting anxiously for Susan's return, it does speak to some, you know, possible deeper romantic feelings that they might have had for each other. I should note that Emily, at this point, you know, she had been attending school, she had been out and about in life, getting around, doing her thing, gaining her education. But then in the mid-1850s, Emily's mother became very, very ill with a chronic illness until her death, so Emily's mother's death, in 1882. So Emily stayed behind to take care of her mom. And so by staying behind to take care of her mom, Emily then started withdrawing more and more and more from the outside world. Now, in the summer of 1858, Emily began reviewing some of the poems that she had written previously. Now, I want to clarify that Emily, during her lifetime, did not publish that many poems. She didn't become known as this famous, well-known, prolific writer until after her death. So while she was still alive in 1858, she started assembling and piling all of her poems together into books that she kept in her bedroom. The 40 fascicles she created from 1858 through 1865 eventually held nearly 800 poems. Now again, no one was aware of the existence of these poems until after she died. Now, Emily was described as having a nervous prostration by a physician when she was still alive. Now, some people today believe that Emily suffered from agoraphobia, maybe epilepsy. For people that don't know what agoraphobia is, it's this fear to either leave someplace or go someplace. And so again, around this time, her behavior started to really change. She stopped leaving her home unless it was absolutely necessary. And as early as 1867, she began to talk to visitors from the other side of a door rather than speaking to them face to face. And so because of this, she later acquired a lot of notoriety for her recluse nature, as she was rarely seen, and when she was usually clothed in white clothing. So I wouldn't be surprised if some people thought she was like a ghost or something. So only a few of the locals in her town in the last 15 years of her life, when she became a recluse, saw her in person. So not that many people, again, saw her in person after she started hiding herself away. Now, her brother Austen and his family, you know, all the drama with his wife and mistress, they started protecting Emily, and they actually decided that Emily was not subject to discussion to outsiders and people outside the home. So that's pretty cool of them. Now, in 1874, Emily's father, Edward, actually suffered a stroke and died. Now, when the funeral was held in her home's entrance hall, Emily actually stayed in her own room with the door cracked open to listen. And she did not attend the memorial service. Again, she just retreated into herself, pulled away from everybody, and barely attended her own father's funeral. But now, Emily, she might have had another romance going on. A man named Otis Phillips Lord, who was an elderly judge on the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court. he became an acquaintance of Emily's from 1872 or 1873. Now, after the death of his wife in 1877, it was rumored that he might have started a late life romance with Emily. But the letters between them were destroyed, so we have no way to actually prove that fact. Now let's talk about Emily's death. So the reason why I haven't gone into much detail with Emily as a writer was, again, because Emily wasn't really known as a writer until after she died. So Emily continued to write in her last years, but she stopped editing and organizing her poems. And now she actually asked her sister Lavinia to burn her papers full of her poems. Now, during this time in the 1880s, this was actually when Austin, remember Emily's brother, met Mabel, his mistress. Now, Mabel actually never met Emily. So this girl thinking that she has a right to talk about Susan and Emily's relationship when she never actually met Emily, okay? But she was always intrigued by Emily. She referred to Emily as a lady whom the people called the Myth. Now, Austin actually distanced himself from his family and wife after he started his affair, and so Susan became weak and ill because of it. And so, amidst all the chaos of Austin's family drama, Emily during this time had lost her mom, as well as her nephew, so Austin and Susan's son, Gilbert. He ended up dying of typhoid fever, and apparently Gilbert was Emily's favorite nephew. So there was just a lot of drama, a lot of pain, a lot of sadness happening. So on May 15th, 1886, after several days of worsening symptoms, so Emily just kept getting sicker and sicker, Emily ended up dying at the age of 55. Austin actually wrote that the day was awful, she ceased to breathe, that terrible breathing just before the afternoon whistle sounded for 6. So the cause of her death was Bright's disease, which was a kidney disease. So now during her lifetime, Emily only published 10 poems and a letter. After Emily died, Lavinia, Emily's younger sister, discovered nearly 1,800 poems that Emily had written during her lifetime. So after Emily died, Lavinia actually kept her promise and burned most of Emily's correspondence, a lot of her papers. Right, but Emily had left no instruction about the 40 notebooks worth of poems she had left behind. Lavinia recognized the poems' worths, and she became obsessed with seeing them published. So Lavinia actually turned to Susan for help, and then later Mabel for help in getting the poems published. Now, there was this feud that ensued, a feud between Susan and Mabel on who would get the manuscripts for the poems. This feud prevented a complete publication of all of Emily's poems for more than half a century after her death. So the first volume of Emily's poetry that was published had 115 poems in it. It was a critical and a financial success, going through 11 printings in just 2 years. Even though a lot of the early reception of Emily was focused on her eccentricities and her secluded nature, she has become widely acknowledged as an innovative proto-modernist poet. Now, since this is not a literature course, I am not going to get into all the nitty-gritty details about Emily's writing. You can go check out some of her poems for herself. But I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit more about Emily Dickinson's life and all that good stuff. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. So don't forget to subscribe and all that wonderful good stuff. If you subscribe, then you can stay tuned for next week when we talk about a French balloonist. Stay tuned for that next week. And I realized that I never introduced our boys today, but we can say goodbye to them even though I forgot to mention them. But if you've seen our other Girl Power history videos, then you know the drill, okay? You know what's up. So I hope you guys have a beautiful, wonderful day. See you.